Hey, what's going on, guys? How is everybody doing? So right now we're in kind of a little lull period when it comes to Genshin Impact content because Xiao is right around the corner. Ganyu content is getting a little stale, and there's really not much content-wise that's out right now. So because we're in kind of a little lull, what I wanted to do today, since a lot of you guys have been asking me, and I know the event isn't happening for a couple more weeks, but is to go over the Stand By Me event. So in case you're not aware what the Stand By Me event is going to be, basically you have a choice of 6 heroes hailing from Liyue. You have Xiangling, you have Xinyan, you have Beidou, you have Ningguang, you have Xingqiu, and finally you have Chongyun. And basically you're going to be able to pick one of these 6 characters to own for completely free. And if you don't have them, you can also get their constellations. So basically the big question is who do you prioritize? Do you go for a new character that you don't have already, or do you go for another constellation? And if that's the case, what constellation do you actually go for, and who do you prioritize? So that's what we're going to go into today. I have these all listed out. We're going to be going over how I would rank them, how I would choose certain priorities over another, and hopefully that helps you out a little bit in choosing who you should go for individually. But before we get into the tier list, I do want to ask you guys to help me out, beat that raid boss that is the YouTube algorithm. Down in the comments below, let me know, what is the character that is currently your favorite aesthetically from Liyue? Mine is kind of a toss-up between Ganyu, Beidou, and Ningguang, quite honestly. Let me know down in the comment section below, what is your favorite character aesthetically? But now let's jump into the tier list, and before we actually do start tearing these out, there are a couple notes that I want to make before we start talking about these, because when we're talking about tier lists are super subjective, and so there are a couple of things that I want to catch before you guys actually go and take my word as concrete not evidence, but whatever it may be, before you guys take this as like gospel. So basically you have to prioritize your own fun first. So just because I put something at the top of this tier list does not mean that you have to go with it. If you don't like a bunch of characters on this list, then it's going to make no sense for you to actually take those into consideration. Go with the hero that you do like the most, even if it's not necessarily highest on the list in terms of constellation, or if you're just going for that hero in general. These are, of course, my own personal opinion. So if there's something that you don't agree with, or if you think that, you know, maybe I'm just not right about something, I do highly suggest you go check out someone else's rankings or ideas of what you should prioritize. I always suggest going out and getting multiple sources. One source is just, you know, not that concrete. So if you do like my opinions, then I say, hey, go for it. But, you know, always figuring out other people's opinions. They might spark a different idea for you that you just might not have thought about, or that I didn't think about. I am going to try and get through these pretty quickly, because as you can see, there are a lot of heroes and constellations here that we have to get through. There are 6 heroes. They all have 6 constellations, plus the 6 heroes themselves. We're talking 42 different aspects that we need to rank here. So if there is something that I want to address more in depth, I'll get to it. A lot of them might just get a quick little brief summary of why I think they fit where they do. But other than that, I'm going to try and go through these as quick as possible, unlike these first couple thoughts that I'm kind of rambling on. And lastly, some of these cons are going to be kind of hard to judge, because they are going to be determined by whether you're playing the character as a carry or a support. So when we get to those constellations, I will kind of make it known that if you're playing a character a certain way, you might want to prioritize that constellation higher based on, you know, higher or lower based on where I put it. So now that all out of the way, we can finally get into the tier list. So how are we rating these? Well, of course, we have our A through F, and we have always prioritize, definitely worth. We have basically really good, pretty worth. We have could be worth, despite what you think, probably not worth. And finally, forget these, not worth. So we have these rated A through F. It's basically just whoever's higher tier is probably going to be more worth it. So let's get right into it. I, of course, do have notes. So if you see me looking off to the side, that's where I'm looking. So with our base characters, I got Xiangling at F tier, Xinyan at C tier, Beidou at B, Ningguang at B, Xingqiu at A, and Chongyun at B. So the reason that Xiangling is so much lower on this list, because this is just the initial character, is because you already get a Xiangling at once you clear Abyss 3-3. So because she's already free, there's really no sense in you getting the base character here for free. Better off to prioritize some of the other heroes. Now, Xinyan being C tier is honestly because I'm not crazy about her as a pyro support. She's pretty decent as a physical support, but overall her numbers just aren't that great. Like, her skills are giving you a 15% bonus or debuff on your enemy, right? But most of the time, if you're going to be using her as a physical support, you're most likely also going to be using a cryo support for that superconduct. And once you get under 0% resistance, all debuffs are halved. So because most enemies only have a 10% physical resistance, once you go under that 0%, they're going to be halved, and 40% is definitely going to drop you under there. So really, Xinyan's physical defense reduction is only going to be like 7.5, which is not that great. And in terms of a pyro support, she's also not that great because her application is not that great. So underneath all these other ones, she's kind of lower. If you do want to use her as like a carry, she's not that bad, but she's just overall not as worth as some of these other heroes. Now, Beidou, Ningguang, and Chongyun are all very good. They're kind of situational. Like Beidou she's a really good carry, she's a really good support, but there are other heroes that are better. So like as an Electro Claymore carry, Razor is just going to do more damage. And if you have a Kaching, you know, she's also just going to be better. In terms of support, like if you have a Fischl and like your team is, you know, pretty tight as it is, Fischl is like technically better, but she's really fun to use. Ningguang is a very good carry. She's not like great at support. She does a lot of damage with her burst, but when it comes down to it, she's a good carry. And the problem with Geo as a carry right now is it's really hard to build. You do really need some of those 5 stars in order to make it as good as possible. Chongyun, I'm not crazy about him as DPS. You can definitely make him work, but as a support, he is kind of limiting because his cryo application is pretty specific in how you use it. But when he's good, he is very good. And Xingqiu is pretty universal as just one of the best supports in the game right now. His Hydra application is absolutely insane. He is a little, how do I want to put it? His skill is kind of not hard to use, but it has a really long cooldown. So he gets like exponentially better if you have a sacrificial sword, or if you just have a lot of energy generation on your team, because it is going to be kind of hard to get that burst, because that burst does cost 80 energy. So, and with his cooldown on his skill costing 20, it's really, really slow. So sacrificial sword is very important for him, but as a support, he's just one of the best out there. So those are all our base versions. Now we're going to be getting into each character individually, and I'm going to be going through their constellations all in order per hero. So looking at Xiangling, we have her C1. I'm putting that at D tier. C2 is going at C. C3 is going at C. C4 at B tier. C5 at F tier, and her C6 is at C tier. So let's talk about the outlier here first, and that is of course her C5. Why is that so bad? Well, when it comes to Gooba's damage not overly important. Really, we just need him there for pyro application. So because of that, increasing the skill of that Gooba, not super important. Moving on to her C1, not super great. You know, getting an additional 15% pyro reduction is fine, but overall, like, Gooba is really not that accurate, and he's probably only hitting 1, maybe 2 enemies at a time. So overall, like, the extra damage is not super worth it. C2, 3, and 6. So C3 is really good at getting that extra damage boost, but overall it's not really adding anything to her kit, so we're not really changing how she plays at all. It's extra damage, but if you compare it to like some of the other constellations that we're going to get to, it doesn't change up her kit at all, and that's why there's things that are just going to be better for it. C2 is very good if you're using her as a carry. This is kind of the first one we're getting to, but if you're not using her as a carry, it's basically useless. So that's why I have her at C tier. You know, this could be like a B tier versus a D tier type thing, or actually even an F tier if she's a support. It's just really like you're not getting any benefit out of it at all. So it's just kind of in the middle there, not super great, but also not super bad. C6 is kind of the same thing as C1, where it really depends on your team composition. Like if you're playing her as a support for a main carry like a Diluc, who's going to do a lot of pyro damage, or even like a Klee, you're going to want to prioritize a bit higher, maybe like B tier. But the thing is, most of the time when you're using her as a support, she's going to be like, you know, double pyro res for a different kind of main character. Or if you are going for pyro res for a main DPS like Diluc or Klee, your other pyro support is probably going to be Bennett if you have it. So because of that, that extra 15% pyro damage is not really going to be beneficial if we're just using our 2 pyro units as a support core, because that damage is really not going to add up that much. And that's why it's just kind of C tier. It's fine. It's a lot better if you're using her as a support for a main carry, or if she is your main carry and you're doing a lot of pyro damage. I would possibly put this up to B tier, but there's a lot of stipulations on that, and that's why I'm putting it down in the C tier. Now, C4 is very, very good. We're taking her uptime from her burst from 10 seconds up to 14 seconds. That 40% extra time is really nice. Overall, though, you know, 4 seconds in the grand scheme of things is not like huge. It is very big. 40% is very, very big. Her cooldown on her burst is 20 seconds, so there's 6 seconds that we're not going to have it uptime versus 10 seconds. But overall, I think there are just better options here than that extra duration. I could also see an argument to bring it up to A tier, but overall, I like the other constellations in A tier above her C4. So I'm still kind of torn. I would probably put it in like B.5. Like, it's like right on the edge for me, but for right now, I am leaving it in B tier. So let's move on to Xinyan next. So Xinyan's C1 is getting a C tier designation. Her C2, we're going up to B tier. C3 down to D tier, C4 C tier, C5 and 6 are D tier. Now let's start with C6 first, because I think that one is one of the more interesting ones in her kit. I'm specifically putting it here in D tier because most likely if you're using a Xinyan, you're going to be using her as support. And as a support unit, this has almost no utility. Like, of course you can use it as a support, but for the most part, you don't really want to use your supports other than like bursting or skills. You want to leave the auto attack damage to your main carry. So as a support, you can use it. It's not super viable. So it's not really F tier because it is potentially worth it. As a carry, this probably goes up to like B tier. It's extremely good. It's going to add a lot of damage to her, potentially even A tier actually, because there's a lot of damage to be had there with a carry Xinyan. But because I feel that most players will be using her as support, we're going to be putting it down in D tier. Now C3 and C5 are both in the D tier just because she doesn't do a lot of damage on her own. You do get a little bit of shield utility out of C3, and C5 does do more damage if you can get her up to C2, which obviously if you're getting C5, you have C2. But overall, I just don't think the extra increase in damage is any better than the other constellations that are going to be higher on this list. C4, while it is C tier, it's fine. You're getting a little bit of extra damage, especially if you're using her as a physical support. But like we talked about when we talked about her base constellation, was that because you're probably already going to be prioritizing superconduct, you're basically not ever going to get a 15% damage reduction, or a physical resistance reduction, I should say. You're probably more likely to get a 7.5 decrease, and that's just really not much. And is it worth using your only constellation pick here for that? Probably not, but it is fairly decent. So she is one of your main supports. That might be one you want to go for. That's why it's in the could be worth. Her C2 is very good. It's easily her best constellation outside of her C6 if you're using it as a carry. When you have C2 Xinyan, it completely changes how you build her. Before C2, I would recommend just going heavy defense and just building her for her shield. However, once you get that C2, because she has a 100% crit rate on her burst, it's actually just better to go crit damage. You just kind of use her shield as it comes. You don't really build into her shield. You just build her for her burst damage, because she can do a lot of damage. And especially if you're using her on a team as a support, you're probably going to be using her as a physical support. So you're already going to have that physical defense down from superconduct, and she's just going to take advantage of that because a majority of her damage from her burst is actually physical. So even though she is a pyro character, most of her damage is physical, and because we can get really big crits, because we already have a 100% crit rate, you just stack her for crit damage and she does absurd numbers. So that is why I put C2 so high. It's definitely not A tier. It's definitely not like 100% worth. But if you do use her heavily, I do suggest getting that C2. Now moving on to Beidou. Beidou is the one that, I'll be honest, I have the least experience with on this team, but I feel like I have these nailed down pretty well. So her C1 we're putting down in D tier. C2 is going up to B tier. C3 back down to D tier. C4, we'll talk about this a little bit, but for right now, we're going to put it down in D tier. C5 in C tier, and finally C6 is going up to the big boy or girl, in this case, A tier. So let's discuss these a little bit. So first, let's talk about her C4, because that's the one that I was most hesitant on. C4 really is only useful if you're going to be using her as a carry. So increasing her normal attacks to do an additional 20% electro damage, right? As we discussed with Xiangling, with one of her constellations, is that if she's a support, you're not really going to be using her auto attacks that much. So if you play her as a support, that C4 really isn't worth it. But if you do use her as a carry, she probably goes up to like B tier. It's actually pretty good. Being able to get that electro damage out, pretty important, especially if you're using like her best in slot Rain Slasher. Well, I guess as a carry, it's probably not her best in slot, but it's pretty good. You get a little bit of extra damage there, and you can consistently apply electro. So now you can use her in conjunction with a cryo hero to get some pretty consistent superconduct procs. But for the most part, I feel like most people will play Beidou as support, and that's why it's down in D, is that it's really not that relevant. You can always, of course, auto attack with your support units, just not super important to do so. C3 and C5 are split a little bit differently, just because I do feel like it's more important to get damage with her burst, because you can just hit more enemies over time, even though you're using your skill more often. If she's being used as support, you're probably more likely building her for her burst than her skill. As a carry, it's probably a little bit better to use her for her skill, but her instant parries already do so much damage. I don't know that it's super likely that you're going to need more damage on her C3 as opposed to anything else on this tier. But for now, I just kind of have it in the D tier. For C1, I could also see an argument moving this up to the C tier, but overall, you know, I don't think that there's like a big necessarily need for shields, and that's why I don't find it super important to get. Like, if you had a C0 Beidou compared to all these other heroes, I would prioritize this fairly low, because I don't think it's super necessary to get that one for her. C2, on the other hand, is extremely good. Being able to have her bursts electrocharged, or not electrocharged, but electro damage jump to an additional 2 targets is, first of all, going to be very good for reactions, because you're spreading that electro even more, but it's just more AoE damage. The more damage we can apply to our opponents, obviously, the faster they are going to die. So that one is very important for both her support and carry builds. C6 is lastly like the constellation that's best utilized on both a support and a carry build. There are not a lot of ways to reduce electro resonance in the game, and this is one of them. So whether you're using her as a support or a carry, she does a lot of electro damage herself, and if you're using her as a support, using that burst to do a lot of AoE damage, you're going to be getting a lot of extra damage from there. That resistance is just, it's fairly important to her build, so if you were wondering whether you should go up to C5 to C6, I would prioritize that pretty heavily. Next up, we have Ningguang. So let's go ahead and put her C1 into B tier. C2 is going into C tier. C3, C tier. C4 down in F tier. C5 in D tier. D tier. And finally, C6 is going up to A tier. C6, easily her best, without a question. Adding those 7 Star Jades is basically another burst by itself. It does a whole bunch of damage. It's like not even a question, best constellation for her. Easy. C1 is pretty good. So the thing with Catalyst users is that unlike your melee counterparts, they can't hit AoE by themselves. Same with bow users. They can't actually hit AoE by themselves. Like your melees, like when they're slashing, they can hit multiple enemies. So having access to that is pretty important, especially if you're doing like, you know, overworld or abyss floors where you have a bunch of enemies that are grouping fairly close to each other, just like a bunch of hilly trolls. It's going to be important to get that AoE just so that way you can do a little bit more damage as a carry. As a support, not very important. Wouldn't prioritize this very much as a support, but Ningguang does fit the carry role a little bit better, so we're putting that up in B tier. C4 is the other outlier. Absolutely awful. I don't really care about defensive constellations, if I'm being honest with you. It really just does nothing overall, so I would prioritize that one very low. C5 is also pretty low because increasing the protection of a Jade screen, like, not super important. You get a little bit of extra damage when you place it, but overall that's not where she's doing a majority of her damage. Most of her damage is coming from her auto attack or burst, and that's why C2 and C3 are here. I am a little bit torn on the C2, I'll be honest. Because I haven't played a lot of Ningguang, I don't actually know why it would be important to have that cooldown reset, since it does reset every 10 seconds anyway. So why do you need just every 6 seconds to be reset? Obviously, you want to keep your shield up, because if you don't know, or I shouldn't say your shield, your Jade screen up, because if you don't know, when you pass through it, it's going to increase her geo damage, or actually your whole team's geo damage. So it is important to keep that up. I just don't actually know the frequency in which it's getting shattered. So if you're finding that your Jade screen is getting shattered quite often, it might be beneficial for you to go with the C2, but overall, that's why it's like, could be worth, it's decent. And her C3, it's just some extra damage. It's fine if you want to go for it, but it doesn't add any extra utility into her kit, and that's why it's, you know, in the middle of the road. Like, it's nice to have that extra damage, but like I said, doesn't add any extra flexibility, utility, tricks, or whatever else to her kit. Next up, we have Xingqiu. So let's go ahead and put a C1 into a D tier. C2 is going into A tier. C3 into B tier. C4 is going into C tier. C5 into C tier as well. And C6 into A tier. So, in case you don't know, Xingqiu, pretty good. You can already see 3 of his constellations are in A tier. So let's talk about these first. C2, Super, super important. So first of all, you're extending the duration of your burst by 3 seconds. That's taking it up from 15 seconds to 18 seconds. And with a cooldown of 20 seconds, you basically have 90% uptime. So as long as you can keep that burst fully generated with energy, you can basically keep this up as much as possible. Plus, you're getting an additional Hydro resist down, which is huge since, of course, all the damage he does is Hydro. So with that burst, you are getting a ton of extra damage. Now, if you also use them as a support for, let's say, Child, there's a very popular Firecracker team going around of Child, Xingqiu, Official, and Beidou. If you're using that, you're going to be doing a lot of Hydro damage, so having that extra Hydro resist down will be very important. But really the thing we're going here, because it's more universal, is that extra uptime. Very, very important. C6 is also very huge. Increasing the damage of his burst is going to be huge. That's where he's getting like the majority of his utility, but also the fact that this is going to help him generate energy. Energy generation for Xingqiu is kind of a problem, especially if you don't have something like Sacrificial Swords, so that way you can use 2 skills in a row. His skill does have a cooldown of 21 seconds, which is very long. So if you're trying to get his burst up as quick as possible, especially if you don't have another Hydro unit on this team, you're not going to be generating a lot of Hydro particles. And because of that, with a burst cost of 80, it's going to take him a long time to get there. So the fact that his burst can actually generate energy for him is a huge boon to him. So if you can get it, that is super relevant. Xingqiu, one of the best supports in the game. So it's really not a bad thing to invest in him if you're looking for that C6. Now, looking at his other constellations, C3, pretty important. Like I said, in the other constellations, when we got to the extra damage, not super relevant, but because Xingqiu is one of the better support units, especially when it comes to these 6, I do prioritize it a little bit higher. And the fact that he just does so many hits with his burst, the fact that it's a smaller percent overall when you're getting this constellation or any constellation that increases damage, because he's getting so many hits, that percentage gets bigger over time, and overall is just one of the biggest damage improvements that we actually have on this list. Now on the flip side of that, C5, it's dropping a little bit lower because it's just increasing the damage of his skill, and as we already discussed, the cooldown is really, really long, so we're not actually going to benefit from that most of the time because that cooldown is so long. Even if you have Sacrificial Sword, you're only getting 2 uses every 20 seconds. That's not a lot of damage improvement. And C4 basically suffers from the same thing. It might look like a lot of increased damage by 50%, but when we look at it, because you're not using his skill that often, it's not a lot of extra damage. So if you can get it, it's very good, but I wouldn't prioritize it over anything above it on this list. Now, C1 is down there because, as I said before, I don't really prioritize defensive abilities very often. If ever, it's just not, I would rather have damaging abilities rather than defensive. So if you don't have, like, if you have everybody else C6, then sure, I would go for it, but I wouldn't prioritize it above anything else on this list, as I've said several times before. Now we get into Chongyun, who is the last one up on this list. So let's go ahead, place his constellations, talk a little bit about him. So C1, down in F tier. C2, up to B tier. All right, got a little bit of improvement. C3 in C tier. C4, F tier. C5, D tier. And C6 is B tier. So let's talk about a little bit why C1 and C4 are down in F tier. The fact is, C1, it's only really affecting the last attack of his combo, and if you know anything about Claymore attacks, that last attack is really slow, and it's actually more efficient to cancel the last attack and just repeat the first 3. So because of that, we're not actually going to be using that last attack, and the only real benefit we're getting from that is if we're using him as a carry, and he actually performs way better as a support. So because there's a small percentage of you that I'm assuming are going to be using him as a carry, and there's an even smaller percentage of you that are probably going to be doing all those attacks. So because of that, it's just not great. Now C4 on the other hand, 1 energy every time he hits in a cold or frozen opponent. Man, that is not a lot. So and it can only happen every 2 seconds. That's just really not that good. There are way better ways to generate energy, so definitely don't prioritize that. C5, not that great. His skill is not there for damage, it's there for cryo application, so we don't really care about getting damage. Of course, any little damage we can get is nice, but it's not super important. C3, a little bit better than a C5 because he does do a lot of damage with his burst, but kind of same thing there is Chongyun as a support is more there for cryo application than straight damage. Of course, you can build him for damage. I'm not saying that he's not good with damage, but for most people, like if you don't have the resources, he's one of those heroes that you can just kind of like not invest in at all, and he's still going to do his job just fine. Lastly, we have C2 and C6. So C2 is an interesting one. Overall, a 15% cooldown reduction does and doesn't sound like a lot. The fact that we're just reducing cooldown, there aren't a lot of ways to reduce cooldowns for skills or bursts in this game. So because we have this one, it's kind of prioritized higher than the others. But at the end of the day, 15% isn't that much, but it is a reduction. So just getting out your skills and bursts faster is going to be quite a significant improvement. Now, it does have the downside that you do have to be within the ring, but that's a pretty small downside. So it is pretty important. If you do like using your Chongyun, that's a pretty good one to go for. And C6 is just extra damage. You know, an extra 15% damage. Most of the time, your enemies are going to have lower health than him, so you're going to get that extra 15%, but really, the extra one blade is the big thing here, especially if you're getting like melts on all these, because they happen so fast, and because you're applying cryo to pyro. If you don't know how gauges work, I got a couple of videos on that quite recently, so I would check those out. But because the elemental gauge application is so low, we can get a bunch of melt triggers off his burst, and you can do really big damage. So having that extra blade there, super nice, and we can get a lot of extra damage from there. And as it turns out, that's actually all we have. That actually, I don't know. Well, I guess maybe it went a little bit faster than I thought. I don't know. I'll have to see the final edit, but I don't know. So that is the final list of how I believe you should be prioritizing these. Of course, this is just my opinion. This is not fact or set in stone at all. So if you disagree with any of my picks, I do suggest going to check out someone else's tier list just to kind of compare and contrast, see where other people are putting certain things, because everyone's opinion is going to be different. And of course, if you don't like playing a certain hero, don't prioritize a certain constellation. But that is gonna do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Just a little bit of an announcement. When Xiao comes out on Wednesday, we will be pulling him here live on YouTube. I do go live shortly after 5 p.m. Eastern. I will be coming here, and then probably around like the 6 p.m. Eastern mark, that's when I'll start doing my pulls. Once we do those polls, I'm going to upgrade him a little bit, and then we'll head over to Twitch and start playing around with him a little bit. I do have to kind of see like what the deal is with these new Jade Seeds. I don't know if we can actually convert Hurricane Seeds. If we do, then I'll probably just be farming those, because I won't really be able to upgrade Xiao. So we'll see. But that is the update for you. If you do want to put that on your calendars to come here and check that out, that would be awesome. But other than that, that's really all I have for today. Thank you so much, guys, for checking out the content. If you want to see some more from me, you can head over to my Twitch page, twitch.tv/xjazze. We stream there 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, after we stream here on YouTube. So go ahead and subscribe, like the video if you liked it, and click that notification bell. That way you never miss a video. And of course, if you want to join our community over on Discord, links are down in the description below. But guys, that's all I got for today. Hopefully you did enjoy, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.